Thank you for joining us today and welcome to CEDA's Infrastructure Conference. I'm Melinda Salento, Chief Executive of CEDA, and it is of course my great pleasure to welcome you all here today and to those of you joining us on the live stream. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to thank them and acknowledge their continuing culture and the contributions that they make to our nation. Today's conference poses the question, is Australia's big infrastructure delivering value? And to say that the focus on this topic is timely is an understatement indeed. We meet today amid unprecedented levels of infrastructure investment, but also in many ways unprecedented demand for and on our future infrastructure investment. Here I'm thinking, of course, about the need for critical infrastructure, the challenges of climate change, both in terms of the emissions footprints of our infrastructure assets, as well as their resilience to climate risks. The sharper focus on supply chains, and in turn road, rail and port infrastructure, as well as the potential implications of new ways of working and new uses for our largest cities and all that means for regional infrastructure. Against this backdrop, it's not surprising that the national conversation about infrastructure has shifted from what can we build to how to build it, how to better coordinate, how to make infrastructure more sustainable, and how we can lift the productivity of the sector both in its direct contribution to productivity through its projects, but also through the activities that it enables. Success or failure on these fronts will mean the difference between capitalising on the mega trends of our time, including radical changes in energy, mobility, data and communications, or being left behind. And it will, of course, determine our ability to meet the needs and demands of individuals, communities and businesses. This conference serves to advance discussion on these critical issues, to highlight priorities and areas for future work, and to make sure that infrastructure provides the foundations for both a strong and dynamic economy, but also for vibrant communities. There are plenty of opportunities ahead, but there is also no doubt that the sector faces many challenges. The construction sector significantly lags others in terms of its productivity. Another challenge is the one felt across the economy, the ability to access the skills needed and to lift diversity. What is clear is the need for business and government to work together with the aim of developing long-term national plans for future infrastructure that helps us as a country meet our emissions goals, infrastructure that incorporates advances in technology, infrastructure that is resilient to climate change, and infrastructure that meets the needs of our communities. The CEDA team and our sponsors have pulled together a really great lineup of speakers today, and we've got a huge program ahead of us. Can I take the opportunity to thank our major sponsors, Arup, IFM Investors, Partners in Performance, and our supporting sponsors, SAP and Sydney Water. Can I also acknowledge that joining us today, all the way from Western Australia, is CEDA Chair Diane Smith-Gander. Thanks for being here, Diane. And New South Wales State Advisory Council member Karen Coker, who is co-chair Australasia Arup. Can I remind our audience that we always like you to participate in our conversations and discussions. You can do that via the Pigeonhole app. Just log on to ceda.pigeonhole.at. The password today is Big Infra. You can ask questions through the app, and you can also vote on the questions of others, which actually really helps us on the stage to get a sense of the most important questions. So can I encourage you to jump on there? For our live stream viewers, you can of course also ask questions that way, but can I let you know that from 12:45 to 2:40 Eastern Daylight Time, you'll be offline while we're having lunch and doing a few other things. We're going to be tweeting throughout the day under the hashtag BigInfra. Follow us at CEDA_news and jump into the conversation. And now, you've probably heard enough from me. Hopefully you've got a sense of what we want to achieve out of the day. But I would like now to introduce Paul Plowman, who is the General Manager, Asset Lifecycle at Sydney Water, to also get us on our way. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Melinda, and may I also pass on my respect to the traditional owners and elders past and present. Sydney Water is pleased to support the CEDA and the discussion today, and a privileged opportunity to make some opening remarks. Sydney Water's capital program this year is around about $1.6 billion, but a growing city means demand will eventually exceed supply. And in the context of ageing assets of our city, reaching capacity, the greenfield nature of growth in our city, and increasing regulatory standards means that there's only one upward pressure on our capital program. There'll be lots of people in the room whose portfolios are well in excess of Sydney Water's, but think about the multiplier effect that water investment has. You can't open an airport without toilets that flush. You can't have a housing-led recovery without water pipes to connect into. And indeed, many of the major infrastructure projects that are planned around our city use a lot of water for construction. And think about the assets that are already in the ground. We have to keep them running because the economy depends on it. But every dollar we spend makes a massive difference to the economy. But it's also paid for by our customers. And in the long term, and within the context of cost of living pressures, every dollar that we spend needs to count. And in the short term, like other regulated entities, our tariffs and revenues are fixed. So labour shortages, market volatility, supply chain challenges, increase in costs, whatever the cause is, global factors or COVID-related, it's a very real and critical aspect of trying to manage with our business. Global events, extraordinary weather events. One year our assets are under amber attack, the next they're 6 feet underwater. Are all challenges that we thought that we knew. It seems volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. It's not something that we planned for in the future, it appears to be our reality at the moment. But there are reasons to be positive. It's circumstances like these that give us reason to take stock, think about the challenges and challenge our traditional perspectives and the way we do things. I'm sure when we look back in 10 years, we'll reflect in this time period as a turning point. And this conference is an important part of the conversation to shape the future way of doing things. At Sydney Water, we've been benefiting recently from our supply chain transformation that we know as the Partnering for Success, or P4S, delivery model. We started out designing it to drive more value for customers, but in the current times it's proving to be an incredibly resilient choice. The transformation is underpinned by 4 key elements. First of all, we started out with the idea of a 10-year partnership arrangement. The adoption of the NEC 4 suite of contracts for all of our projects are plain English contracts that are flexible in design and that can fit each project as they come along, but it also frames up what it means to work together as opposed to against each other. The concept of shared purchasing, our category management across all of our programs leverages scope and scale over a long period. So our supply chain, we can develop long-term relationships, and all of those categories can be accessed by our delivery partners. It's whoever can provide the most value. And lastly, 50% of our program will be delivered by 3 regional consortia, integrated teams that provide end-to-end design, construction, maintenance and facilities management. I'd like to think that it's a win-win-win for all. It's longer-term certainty for our partners to plan and grow their business. It's access for us around resources and skills, and for our customers, it's about working together to be more productive and better every day. So I'm looking forward to hearing from probably more than 20 speakers today, and I'm delighted to introduce the first session, Australian Infrastructure from Stimulus to Value, with Infrastructure Australia CEO Romilly Mathew and Chief of Policy and Research Peter Colosino, and the session will be moderated by CEDA's Chief Economist Jared Ball. Jared, Romilly, Peter, welcome to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I was just reflecting before we came on. I've seen a little bit of Peter and Romilly in the virtual sense over the last couple of years, and it's actually both surreal and delightful to see you in real person. It's fantastic. So we've got about 25 minutes. I'm going to have a little bit of a chat with Peter and Romilly. It's timely because Infrastructure Australia has just released its report delivering outcomes, a reform roadmap to increase productivity, innovation and sustainability in infrastructure delivery. And Romilly's just held up the report. There are also QR codes on the tables if you haven't already seen it, so you can get straight onto the link. A lot of reforms in it need to be led by government, but there's been extensive stakeholder consultation and also the opportunity today to have further discussion around it, and as I understand it, it's also out for comment until the end of April, so some fantastic opportunities there. We only have 25 minutes, but I will try and get to at least one question in Pigeonhole, as Melinda mentioned, so please do jump on Pigeonhole as well. Romilly, I want to start, I guess, at the sort of macro level and what this report is all about. It seeks to identify tangible sort of reform actions over the next decade, not just the next few years, which I think a lot of people are very focused on in terms of the record pipeline that we have at the moment. In terms of those sort of actions, I mean, what are the biggest challenges that you think we need to really grapple with and address in the next decade?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. I think if one of the things we all recognise coming off the back of COVID is the resilience of our infrastructure pipeline and the changes that we've seen in the last 3 years. You know, if we think about pre the 2019 election and now we're thinking about the 22 election, times have changed. When you look at market constraints, we've got $53 billion build by 2023, and we're all aware of the supply chain constraints. Add on top of that the climate extreme weather events we've been having. So when we did our market capacity work, we hadn't taken into account that the whole of East Coast was going to flood, and you know, in some cases needs major building. That isn't being picked up in the market capacity constraints. We've also got a shortfall in labour, increase cost of materials, and then add on top of that we're dealing with global events such as the Ukraine war, and that's just on the capacity constraints. Melinda referred to the productivity in our sector. Construction has the lowest productivity of any sector in when you're looking at across the other sectors under the ABS. There's a lot we need to change. BAU is not good enough anymore. We get pockets of innovation in Australia. It just needs to be, those pockets of innovation and productivity need to be BAU. So if we've got this high pipeline spend, we need to see reform, and it needs to start ASAP. We have the lowest rates of technology take-up. There's some great examples of technology take-up. We've seen that through COVID, but it needs to be faster. Highest rates of suicide is in construction and lowest rates of female participation. You've just got to look at what's happened over the last 3 weeks when it comes to financial sustainability. ProBuild and ConDev on the eastern states and Pindan in Western Australia. That's just in the last 3 weeks. And the industry has been saying this was going to happen. This is not new. It has been talked about for a long time that this was on the cards. And the final one is really the climate risks and the global impacts of what is happening. Just one figure. So I've just talked about public infrastructure is 20% of the whole pipeline. In the G20, $3.2 trillion of stimulus has been put on the table in the last 18 months. So before COVID, we were competing with states. So if there was a boom and bust in WA, staff would come over to the eastern states or so on and so forth. So we were just competing within Australia when we were trying to build these big infrastructure builds. We are now competing globally. So globally, we are competing for talent. Migration is not the only answer. If only 2% of women are on site, we've got all these other women that could come on site. We have to fix the culture of our sector to attract, to make our sector a really attractive place to work. So I know it sounds like there's a lot of challenges, but the report really identifies how industry and government can work together in the future in how we can make sure that we are doing better.
Thanks, Romilly. And of course, one of those big focuses in the report is around an outcomes-focused approach as a means of meeting those challenges. Peter, can you just elaborate for us a little bit on how an outcomes-based approach would differ from the status quo at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you're quite right. The report lays out really a roadmap or a foundation for change, and outcomes is one of those 7 planks. The focus is really, exactly as we heard the focus at Sydney Water, shifting that idea that infrastructure is about concrete and steel or nuts and bolts to really recognising it's about people and places and industry enablement, and building that sort of thinking into the way projects are contracted. So we have a very rigid contracting environment at the moment, and far too often we see clients really relying on what's come before or an approach that's really just kind of built into standard practice rather than trying to think about the specific benefits of projects trying to deliver. So Partnering for Success has been about that change in the way that we view it, and certainly in our Delivering Outcomes report, Partnering for Success is flagged as one of those innovative delivery models that's been adopted in Australia and yielding results. So what we want to see is this shift to thinking much more about the context of work within the strategic priorities of government. We want to see a quadruple bottom line view of sustainability embedded in project thinking. And the FAIR scheme that's been promoted by the Australian Contractors Association over the last few weeks is a great foundation of that. We speak about a similar model as an alignment card within delivering outcomes, but this idea of FAIR, a benchmark against which all projects can be measured so that we can understand the contribution to people, places, strategic outcomes and sustainability, seems to us to be on the right track.
All right, and Romilly, a big part of this outcome focus is on people and place. So how do we move to more of a focus on people and place with infrastructure projects in this outcomes-based framework?
We really need to engage with our communities when there's these large-scale infrastructure projects being thought about or in reform. It's how do we engage with our communities and make sure that their voice has been heard. And that has to be incorporated into the decision-making process. We have to be held account if we're not having fair and reasonable stakeholder engagement. And, we see examples of this time and time again where a decision's been made about a project and hasn't taken into account the local community's wants and needs. And so it's really looking at the decision-making process. People in place, outcomes for people in place is the first element of the reform, and it really puts the onus on the delivery agencies and the sector to ensure that they are authentically engaging through place-based mechanisms with the community. And the great thing about the technology that has been used in the last couple of years is no more do we have to do those 5 o'clock turn up to a round table and engage. We have the online tools that we can engage in an authentic way and get a lot of feedback through from people and be able to use the data to find where the patterns are. There is not an excuse anymore not to engage through stakeholder engagement and giving the community a voice on what is happening in their place.
Thanks, Romilly. I guess the other underpinning a little bit of this outcomes-based approach, Peter, is around systems thinking and thinking about infrastructure as a system, not as a thinking. How can governments and businesses embrace this sort of systems-based thinking? Where do we start?
Well, within the context of the infrastructure sector, systems has two real lenses. The first of them is this idea that a project doesn't sit in isolation. And really, a project, indeed, building on this outcomes approach, is designed to enable a change in services for users. It might be an improvement in quality, it might be an improvement in costs, an improvement in access, but projects shouldn't be seen in isolation. So we really need to make sure the views of operators are brought to bear in understanding the transformative impact a project can make. The second piece, though, is about the supply chain and thinking about the role of infrastructure, not only as a client and a prime contractor in this sort of sworn battle to the death where one will lose and one will win, but in fact, it's much more about an environment where each party can contribute and can do its best, this win-win-win, as we heard earlier. And I think about some of the work that Arup and Richard Sharp did around looking at enabling faster rail, particularly on the east coast of Australia, this idea of bringing all of the parties together, from Transport for New South Wales to rail industry providers and indeed ourselves, to speak about changing the sector. Or I think about some of the conversation that Peter Truman and McKinsey are having at the moment about enabling change in the sector, seeing the role as not just being for 3 tier 1 contractors, or for that matter, even for 20 contractors, but the role that advisors can play, the role that a supply chain can play. And when we speak to major resource extractors at the moment, the people who provide rock or cementitious materials into the sector, they tell me they can't get enough pallets, let alone trucks, in order to get material to site. That will have consequences for contractors. It will then have knock-on impacts for the operators who are relying on those projects to drive change. And if we want to deliver an outcome for communities where they're not sitting with the city opened up for years waiting for a project to be completed, we need to address those things at the front end. So this systems approach is about bringing all of that from the back, cost overrun, delay, claim, litigation, to the front, so there can be an honest conversation about how to get things done.
I'll just remind people that the Pigeonhole platform is open for questions, and I'm actually a little bit confident that I might be able to do 2 questions. So please jump in there. I've got one so far. A lot of this, obviously, Romilly, and the report touches on this, comes down to people, and Melinda, others have mentioned, issues around diversity and culture. What are the steps that organisations need to be taking to create an enabling culture in terms of capability, diversity, performance here?
What infrastructure sector can learn is there are great examples in Australia around where diversity and inclusion has been incorporated into projects and programs. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. But what's really disappointing is we're not seeing a change in the dial. We've seen some increase in the last couple of years, but considering that 47% of the workforce is women and we see 2% of women on sites, construction sites, it's not good enough. And when we see only 12% of women are working in construction companies, we need to be moving much faster. So we really need to look at targets with teeth. They need to be incorporated into procurement models and be serious about diversity and inclusion. So it's not just gender diversity, it is also ensuring that we have a diverse workforce, and we're also incorporating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and there are great examples of how projects have done that. New South Wales and many other state and territory governments have, through their procurement process, have ensured that there is a skills uptake with First Nations people in the procurement program. But it's got to be serious, and it's got to start from the top, and it's got to be incorporated into leaders' KPIs, and we have to look at the unconscious bias. There's been enough reports that have come out over the last 2 years that are showing it's still in place, this terrible culture. Why would a woman or somebody, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, want to work in such a combative and aggressive culture? They just don't. And so we are not attracting them to our workplace. So leadership have to be serious about looking at, open culture where we can look at flexible work arrangements. And Roberts Pizzarotti have done that. They've looked at the working week. We know that there's high rates of suicide. We know that working on construction sites can be really challenging. And we know through COVID we can work flexibly, and we can do job sharing, and we can work online. So we can show that we can do this, but there has to be a real need to change. The ACA, we keep calling out John and his team at the ACA, but they have worked with a construction, culture and construction task force. There's a culture standard that's out for discussion at the moment, and Infrastructure Australia is seriously looking at incorporating the culture standard into our assessment framework, and that's a great start. So SILF, the Construction Industry Leadership Forum, is made up of the industry and a number of states and territories in Australia. And so the work has started, but it just needs to be mainstream. It can't be pockets of seeing people in leadership. It needs to be mainstream like it is in other sectors. And we need to do it really quickly. So look at the work the ACA is doing as a great start.
And we will be hearing from John in a couple sessions' time. I'm sure that topic will feature prominently. We do have some. I've created an avalanche of questions, which is good. So the first one, perhaps to both of you, collaborative contracts, no price competition. What protections will there be for taxpayers for poor infrastructure delivery if government bears the majority of the risk? And that is from Anonymous.
Well, that's a great question from Anonymous in many ways, I have to say, because what we're not about is giving the government's game away. We're about protecting taxpayers, and we're about driving value for money outcomes. And the way that you do that is through maintaining competition, absolutely, making sure there's competition in the tender box, but that you're thinking about different forms of contracting that might drive, for instance, long-term partnerships through delivery programs. And again, Partnering for Success has been about that, but so too the types of partnerships that we see around either asset leases or PPPs in the industry, which drive a long-term relationship. But what we need to do is make sure that that competition isn't just about lowest cost, it's about greatest value for money. And that when we move into the delivery phase, we're driving increased price scrutiny through the use of should-cost models in order to drive benchmarking throughout project performance. We really have this focus at the moment through false confidence in the tender box, where we're saying, here's a hard dollar, single price that will be delivered. We lock in a bunch of risk transferred to the private sector and think, great, that's it. Government's in a perfect position, no worries, see you in a few years' time. But what we see time and time again is cost overruns, time blowouts, scope changes. What we need to do is make sure that what we're able to achieve is a sharing of fair risk between parties. And you hear it time and time again, but sitting with the party best placed to manage it. And we need to make sure that everyone across the project is tied into delivering those outcomes through the way that their commercial frameworks are structured, which is to make sure that there's a fair return for people for fair work.
Peter, a follow-up for you, Anonymous again. I have to ask this one because it has 4 votes. You note the systems thinking approach needed and that infrastructure not be considered in isolation. How is this realised when budgets are allocated in isolation?
Yeah, again, a wonderful question. I have to say, Infrastructure Australia is extremely privileged that we're in a position where we can talk about reforms in government and industry and across levels of government. And we also tie into both a global and domestic network of I-bodies. There's quite a few I-bodies represented in this room today, Jeremy and Jonathan in particular, who are really pushing to make sure that the consideration within the discussion for Infrastructure Australia is not just the federal government view, but brings to bear the views of states and territories and considers the unique positions in different geographies. But making sure that we're able to move beyond just discussion into practical action is, as you say, it's really about dollars. So we need to make sure that governments, in their discussion around infrastructure spending, look across portfolios. They consider the interplay between the housing market, between infrastructure delivery and private construction, so that we can manage a pipeline of work across industries, and so that we can also consider reform that is able to be led by industry as well as government. So the need for change is really common. It needs to consider local circumstances in defining the reform path, and as I say, that's the strength of the iBody network. But in order to be successful, we need industry to take the lead on the things that matter to them. And we need to see government build a view of its own pipeline, which is sector agnostic and has regard for the priorities of different levels of government.
All right, two more. I'm going to do two more questions from the audience. Daniel Kenny and has 5 votes, so again I have to ask it. Do you think BCR is fit for purpose in terms of evaluating projects where issues such as people, place and resilience are of increasing importance?
This is my favourite question. If any of you have read our assessment framework that we released last year, and the team are over here who pulled that assessment framework together, the front page says Beyond BCR. So we have taken a view in working with the iBodies around Australia that it is more than just looking at benefit cost ratio. We look at 3 key elements. One is strategic fit, so how does it fit in with the states and territories' own strategic plan? The second one is societal impact, and so we're looking at a number of things, including people, place, sustainability, resilience and engagement with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the final one is deliverability. And recently, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we released a business case for North-South Corridor in Adelaide, and that had a BCR below 1. So we're already showing that you don't have to base it on BCR, and that's happening not only in Australia but globally. You do need to show its societal impact, but Infrastructure Australia, welcome the opportunity to work with the states and territories to take a forward-looking approach on how we're assessing these investment projects.
All right, final question, and Anonymous has delivered the goods again in terms of a really great final question to ask you. Firstly, a comment, great report, which is good to hear. But their next question is, and I guess this goes also to your process in terms of comment till the end of April as well, what's the right next step to mobilise the industry to action? So what's the next step that you'd like to see in terms of engagement with the report and mobilising action?
Well, I mean, the starting point is just to speak a little about our process to date. So we partnered with HKA to deliver the report and looked across experience from Project 13 and the Institution of Civil Engineers in the UK. We spoke to the Admiral who worked on US Navy force deployment, looking at what practices we could take from the military and, for that matter, tourism and a range of other sectors. So this process of information gathering so far looked to the best we had domestically in the infrastructure sector. It looked to international leaders, and it looked across a range of other sectors to try to draw in good practice. The way that we can deliver or strengthen delivering outcomes is really to bring in that rich diversity of views. We're seeking diverse opinions to strengthen that report, and we're looking for a reality check from those in the sector in Australia about what can reasonably be achieved. But ultimately what we want in that report is a rallying cry, a central point for people to rally around and to say, yes, reform is needed. Infrastructure Australia's perspective may not be perfect. In fact, I'm confident it's not, but it's a step in the right direction, and it's something that hopefully everyone can take a clear action from. Individual organisations can say, for me, leading on well-being is critical. Or perhaps we can lift our diversity target. Did you know that in our main contractors, there are 6 that have all-male boards? I would love to see those 6 contractors pick up female representation in their boardroom. Ultimately as directors, but as a starting point today as advisors, I'd like to see organisations make the point to lead on digital in Queensland, where they've lent into the digital challenge for the Olympics. There's a perfect opportunity to lead practice there. So this opportunity is to choose the pieces that matter most. If you're an organisation in the sector. If you're a government, it's the opportunity to commit to the reform program and to feed into the National Cabinet reform process. And if you're an organisation, just pick the one thing that matters to you and drive it forward. Or if you're an organisation outside of infrastructure, tell us your great ideas, let us promote them in the sector, and receive the recognition you deserve for the reform and innovation you've shown in your own industry.
Can I just pick up that last point really quickly? What is really important is that we see the case studies and best practice examples. What is lacking in the industry is sharing information. It does not happen naturally. And what's come out of the important role of the iBodies is we work really collaboratively together. So when Northern Territory created its own iBody at the end of last year, it drew on all the best practice that the other iBodies had already put in place. So it wasn't reinventing the wheel. So all the way through the report, you see these great examples of best practice, but there are going to be some other gems out there we're not aware of, so please share them with us. But we need to share this. We need to be better at sharing what best practice looks like so we don't constantly keep reinventing the wheel.
Well, I think that's a great place to end, a little bit of a rallying cry from both of you to everyone in the room and beyond. Could you please join with me in thanking Romilly Maju AO and Peter Colicino. So, slight change of pace now. We do have a wonderful opportunity to get a global perspective on these issues now. Guy Turner is the Director and Head of Europe at Partners in Performance, and Guy has a depth of experience across a range of mega projects. He's a recognised expert in building high-performing capital project teams and businesses. Please welcome Guy Turner to the stage. All right. I feel a bit like I'm doing infrastructure speed dating at the moment, but it is...
You think you do?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you do. You've landed in the country on Saturday.
Yep.
And so great to have you here at this conference. And as I said to you before we started, getting some global perspectives on what's happening.
Thank you for having me.
So you would have heard from there. I'm sure you're aware there's a really strong impetus here in Australia, no doubt in other advanced economies as well, around driving stronger industry productivity and performance, particularly given the record level of infrastructure spend that we're seeing, but also the challenges that we're seeing around supply chains and skill shortages as well. So based on what you're seeing globally, if we want to get really serious about getting better infrastructure delivery, what's the most important kind of shift that you think we can make? And how are you seeing this play out in Europe and other jurisdictions?
So I'm not going to talk big strategy because we're in the business of sort of getting stuff done. I think Paul is going to smile. I apologise if I say some things that may be confrontational to some other messages. I think there are three things that I'm seeing successful projects and portfolio managers do really well. And I want to reinforce that. There's a very famous sort of overly used chart from either The Economist or the FT or something that shows construction is this appallingly bad industry that is terrible at innovating and all the rest of it. And the rest of the world's doing fantastically. And then there's another chart that says 76% of all projects are late, or we can find that quote if we want. Yeah, but there's also some incredibly good projects that come in on time and in full. So what we should be doing is learning from those. And they do amazing things. So let's not beat ourselves up too much. I think there are three things that the industry needs to focus on: collaboration, innovation, and changing how we project manage, enhance project management. And if I had to choose one, it would be collaboration. Okay? The trouble is, I think we don't actually understand what collaboration means. So in the spirit of getting specific, collaboration, integration, put it under one term. To me, it means, and this is where I've seen it be incredibly successful, that the owner and the contractors, are mutually in the project for their mutual success. And let's be pretty blunt about this. That means the owner gets the project on time, in full, and under budget. Okay? That means that the contractor makes more profit than they were expecting. And that means that the project director and the project manager, senior project director from the contractor, sit down every day and say, how do we make both of those things happen? They make decisions to make both of those things happen. I was working on a project over in the States recently where the two project directors were incentivized. Their bonuses, while the quantum may have been different, the percentage of the bonuses they achieved were on the measurement of those two results. They were mutually linked to get both of those two results. You have to get, that's the starting point. If we don't agree that we're there for both people to be successful, we won't succeed. Second point, it's a long-term partnership. When you look at the big high-rise, the big successful high-rise builders, they have long-term relationships. Sure, they compete them, but they're so confident they're going to give their portfolio of work to those three contractors on a regular basis unless those contractors fail. That the contractors know that there's a portfolio of work coming towards them. They know they're going to want to work again and again and again. They don't let each other down. This is not a one-shot game. So Paul's point about choosing three contractors and working with them, and we shouldn't say it's not possible. The Nuclear Decommissioning Authority has just appointed 3 contractors in the UK to work with them for the next 10 years. They don't know the projects they're going to be working on. They don't know how much money, they don't know what it's going to be bid at. They're going to one of these 3 contractors because they view it's better to have those contractors working on the portfolio projects from day one, continually to get better and better and better than to compete every project. So the second term is long-term partnership, and the third is involvement from day one. And we've seen that time and time again, whether it's in the development, commercial development space, people like Nuclear Decommissioning. If you don't get that right, you fail. Just before leaving collaboration, I think it requires a change. You need strong, intelligent owners teams. What do I mean by strong, intelligent owners teams? Owners teams that make decisions to achieve those 2 targets early. So intelligent means they know what those 2 targets look like and they know how to make the decisions. We've got to stop reacting to problems. We've got to make decisions early, and fundamentally, the owner has to do that. What does your strong, intelligent owners team look like? And if you scratch the surface and find the projects that are really successful, those are the ones that have strong, intelligent owners teams. 2, utter transparency. There's a lot of contractors in this room that have now felt very uncomfortable, right? Total transparency of all of the stuff that's coming towards us so owners and project directors can make decisions before it's too late. Trust. I mean total digital transparency. I haven't quite done that yet. That looks like it's going to be painful. How do we work together to fix it? And so that we push one back to the government, less red tape. Project Speed in the UK, if anybody's in the rail industry, is all about less red tape. To start with, it's a condition. We want to halve the time it takes to do rail projects in the UK. The first thing the government said is we need to get rid of the red tape. I don't think it's the red tape inside the owner, it's the red tape around the owner, right? It's everything that gets in the way of executing these projects. So I think collaboration, if I only had one thing, be that.
And
Does that make sense?
On the collaboration point, which party do you think needs to make the bigger shift, or what are the different shifts for the owner versus the contractor in making that collaboration work?
Owner first. Owner needs to decide it's going to treat its contractors very differently. It needs to be big enough to say, I'm only going to work with those 3. And if one of those 3 isn't quite performing, I'll change it out. But I'm committed to trying to make those 3 work. I'm not going to nickel, I'm going to be intelligent. I'm going to know how much things should cost, and I should work out how to make them better each time. I'm not going to nickel and dime them. I think that's a big change for the owner. But contractors better trust that the owner is going to try and do the right thing. So I think the owner has to move, and that's the biggest change. But the contractors have to walk in with a level of trust. I talked about total openness. That's scary territory for a lot of contractors.
And I think in your comments you mentioned the nuclear decommissioning example in the UK. Clearly there are perhaps small-based examples of this working. Is there any country that you identify that's hitting this out of the park, or is it a lot of different examples that we need to be looking at and trying to translate those into the Australian context?
I don't think anybody's knocking it out of the park. I think the general Europeans, if you scratch the surface of some of the European infrastructure owners, it's not looking too special. The UK is issuing a lot of big documents, and I think it's doing quite well. Somebody mentioned Project 13, and there's been precursors to that. I think those have been good thought documents. The states, some of the individual states over in the United States are doing well. I don't think you should look to countries. I think you should look to projects and owners that have taken up those reports and what is said inside those reports and gone and done things differently. I don't think you're going to find an answer by looking for a country. Go and look for organisations that have done things differently.
Maybe if we could change tact, I'm conscious of time. So we've talked a lot about the immediate kind of performance challenges. But if we lift our gaze, of course, there's this enormous challenge coming down at us in terms of the transition to net zero. And that requires a lot of building of infrastructure. And it's something that I know that you've talked about and quite passionate about. What's the kind of quantum of challenge and infrastructure that we need to be building up to meet this net zero challenge? And what does that require in terms of performing differently and being ready for that challenge?
The thing that scares me the most is if you look at the medium term and the long term of net zero, it's all about capital projects, right? It's huge. And we have I hope we laugh somewhere through this, we have a small, unique challenge. It's all got to be done by a particular date, and it all has to be done on time, in full. We're not very good at doing that in this industry. So the two things that our kids require of us are the things we're not very good at. And because of the majority of this change has to be executed by the construction industry, it's a pretty big ask. What scares me the most, and I think it's really relevant to the government infrastructure owners here, is if you start scratching the surface and you sort of do the why, what. Everything's going to have to happen at exactly the same time. I think somebody said it earlier, everywhere in the world. I think you were talking about people. Yes, sure, I'm worried about people. I'm actually not worried about people as much as I'm worried about the supply chain. So I think there's three problems. There's supply chain, there's coordination, and there's getting stuck in what I call the traffic jam. The big one, to my mind, is the supply chain. Let me give you an example. If we want to put, there's a great plan in the UK, and the National Audit Office has signed it off as, if you do the plan, you will succeed. Yahoo! The government's actually done something the National Audit Office agrees with. It requires as one of the items to put 30 to 40 gigawatts of wind power in the North Sea. Okay, that's fine. That requires us to totally rebuild the grid on the right-hand side of the United Kingdom, because we're full. We've put 10 extra gigawatts in and we're already full. That requires enough cable to be put on the east coast of the UK to go from Perth in Scotland to Perth in Western Australia and 1/3 the way back again. If I was the UK government, given that that copper has to be supplied at the same time as all the other copper in the UK and all the other copper in every other country in the world, I'd buy a mine and a cable factory pretty damn quickly. If you think about that as you go across all of the other very similar things that are going to have to be bought by governments, by companies at the same time somewhere across the world, I'd be
Recording
really
in
worried.
progress.
I'd be really worried about locking up the supply chain to actually execute all of this work. I'd be really worried about the government coordinating all the work so it doesn't all happen in year 8, because it will fail. And by the way, only the government can coordinate that, because private industry won't do it, right? And I get really worried about it all getting stuck under normal projects. We're not under normal projects, we have to get moving. So I think the government has a role to play in saying, we've got to take big steps to control this portfolio before it bites us in 8 years' time and we all fail.
Guy, you seem to. I've seen a lot of very focused looks around the room in response to that example. So I think wonderful to get your global perspectives. We have run out of time, but fantastic to get those examples and
Sorry, I spoke
also
too much.
I think it was appreciated by the room based on some of the looks that I was seeing as you were talking about the transition to net zero, so don't apologise at all. If you could join with me in thanking Guy Turner. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, mate.
All right, the final part of my infrastructure speed dating for now. We've had the national eye-body perspective, we've had the global perspective, now it's time to get an industry perspective. What's the capability of the industry for transformation? What's the size of the prize? What are some of the key levers that we see in terms of productivity and cultural change as well? And how does the relationship between industry and government need to change? So we've got a fantastic panel to discuss this. John Davies, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Constructors Association. Bede Noonan, the CEO and MD of Acciona Geotech Holdings Proprietary Limited. Severed Robin, the Chief Executive Officer of Bouygues Construction Australia. And we do have an apology, unfortunately, from Gillian Cottle, the National Lead Commercial and Technical at RPS Group, who's had an unfortunate accident and not able to join us for this panel. So we apologise for that, and unfortunately a reflection of some of the issues that we were talking about earlier in terms of diversity and female participation in the sector. So we will proceed with the panel on that basis. So if the panellists could come and join me, and please welcome them.
A couple more chairs?
They'll come.
We have to
We're just
bring our own chair.
going to move some furniture around.
That's it. Well, we're constructors. I thought
Yeah.
you'd get us working.
Yeah.
So.
All right, so I might start with you, John. We've talked a lot about some of the changes that need to be made. And I guess there's not necessarily a great historical record of pursuing change and productivity improvement. So interested in your perspectives about how it can be different this time, and what we've learnt from past kind of tries at this. But also, what are some of the kind of prizes on offer in terms of productivity benefit? What can that unlock for us in terms of our infrastructure program?
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to first start off by just thanking Infrastructure Australia, Romilly and Pete and commend them on their great report that they've launched today. And most importantly, insofar as this question, it's important as well, is just the level of collaboration between IA and industry has been really, really welcome. In terms of what makes this different now to what we've seen before, we've got this huge burning platform for change. COVID has created a lot of problems for us here in Australia and also worldwide, but it also creates a very significant opportunity for us, because what we see is governments at all levels looking to infrastructure to drive the economy forward. I don't need to say here to a room full of people focused on economics that it's economics 101, every dollar spent, infrastructure, $3 kick on to the wider economy. So therefore it's not surprising that we're seeing this record level of investment. But what IA highlighted last year was that we've got a real problem here. We've got potential shortfall of 105,000 people within the next 18 months to deliver this record pipeline of work. We've also got an industry that's being relied upon that accounts for nearly a quarter of all insolvencies in Australia, and we've seen that recently play out with both ProBuild and Condev. We have an industry where only 12% of our workforce are women, and even more shockingly, our workers are 6 times more likely to die from suicide than they are from a workplace incident. So we've got a few problems, but this is why this is a great opportunity to do something about that. We're all aligned, I think someone was mentioning before in terms of contracts, the need to align everyone on a same set of outcomes. And that's what we've got with our industry now. And the prize that you were talking about is enormous. If we look at productivity alone, and I know there was some talk previously about that famous graph. What that graph shows is that the gap in productivity growth between construction and other major industries over the last 30 years is 25%. Now, if you put that into context and say, well, what does that actually mean? And let's not suggest that we can close that gap completely. Let's just say, let's set ourselves a little target. Let's just say we'll halve that gap. Based on the volume of work that the construction industry did last year, the opportunity here in Australia is $15 billion. Just have a think about that for a second. $15 billion. What will $15 billion buy you? It'll certainly buy you Scott Morrison's $10 billion nuke sub-base. It'll pay one inland rail, a whole new inland rail, or it'll put a new hospital and school in every state and territory in this country every single year. That's the opportunity that we have. So when you see a lot of talk about budget repair and the opportunities and scrabbling around for money here and there to pay for these, the pork barrelling that Marion Terrell was talking about in her report today, this is the opportunity you have. Why are we not looking at this and focusing on this opportunity? Because it's huge.
Thanks, John. And so, Pete, if we're talking about that gap and trying to bridge that gap, where would you go first? Where do you think whether you want to talk about the opportunity or the current challenges, where would you go in terms of changing our approach and starting to lift productivity?
Well, in a direct sense, I feel there's enormous opportunity in design, in our ability to change the holistic design of our projects. The productivity, we tend to focus a lot on how quickly you can pour the concrete or dig the hole or drill the hole. The truth is that our subcontractors, our on-the-ground people, I think are incredibly efficient and are always searching globally for the smart and the smartest way. We have a foundations business which works both as a subcontracting building and a subcontractor both to ourselves and other infrastructure parties. And I know that on a 10-hour day, we get about 7 hours work on an infrastructure project, on a piling crew. On a building job, we get about 9 hours work. So there's about a 15% productivity gap just on available, just barriers to stop you working efficiently. But the big opportunity is on a building job where I'm designing, constructing the foundations as that part of, we're a very big infrastructure business. We have this smaller specialist part. The design in building, I can put a really efficient, do my own design for the foundation for Australia 101, which is a 100-storey building in Melbourne. I go to an infrastructure job, there's no chance of me getting that design through, none whatsoever. It will cost about 4 to 5 times more to do the same foundations in infrastructure. So we don't have to look offshore, we don't have to look very far, we've actually already got it in building, vertical building construction for the private sector is incredibly more efficient than infrastructure. So that design, but also our own behaviours as constructors, which is limiting, or as industries, but particularly by us constructors, which is limiting those available work hours and how efficient we can get. And that's priced in by the subcontractors, and that's what costs money, and that's a lot of what John's talking about unlocking. So the final piece I would say is where Guy went to in his discussion about getting involved earlier. We've had, we're on our third major project tender where we've been putting up major opportunity change which haven't been able to taken up. So we're talking about multi-billion-dollar projects where we have identified many hundreds of millions of dollars of savings that haven't been able to be taken up because of the planning or EIS process that occurred before we got involved, and the time and cost of that change is not something that the procurement authority is willing to do. Fair enough, but it tells you who should be getting involved way, way earlier as far as really working out what's the most efficient way to develop this project. So I see that as going towards the design also. We're not just construction companies. Most of us globally are very large engineering companies. We have big research and development teams. We've got our own big engineering and long-term people. We can add a lot of value well before these decisions are made, which are very hard to change.
Thanks, Pete. I do want to remind people of Pigeonhole. It's up on the screen behind you, so please get your questions in. We will certainly have more leeway to ask more questions in this session, so please don't hesitate to get in there and get your questions in. But I do want to turn to CEDA in the meantime and ask you the same question around where you would go in terms of bridging this productivity gap. CEDA?
Thanks, Gerard. One addition to what Bede said is with the sustainability objectives and the reduction in carbon emission objectives we all have now, I would say it's not only that we could be more efficient in the design, is I think we have a duty, and the industry has a very important duty to put in concrete only the reinforcements that is actually needed, required, and the concrete volumes which are actually required, and not much more. So actually, how do we make this happen is an important question, because not only we are slower and it costs more because we put more quantities than required if the design is not efficient or optimized, but also the carbon footprint is larger. So I think when we were talking about, Romilly talked earlier about the objective set in government contracts, I think in terms of sustainability and carbon footprint, this is probably coming very soon, and that will be a task for us and for our design teams and designers to achieve. Now, Gerard, to your question, I think, look, in what we do, for instance, in tunneling, we essentially self-perform, and the productivity comes with the training and our supervision and the people that we keep training, and that from one job to the next one, we talked about repeat and continuity. I think that's very important. So for me, the effort is in keep self-performing and use our key supply chain for the activities we know they're good at, because having a supply chain that follows us from one job to the next one, usually we are always more efficient and faster from one job to the next one, so that's very important. And in automation and innovation, there is surely a lot to do. So on tunnel boring machines, on mine tunnels, we keep innovating from one job to the next one, and there is a lot we can do. I mean, if we can use less people on a tunnel boring machine, it's better for safety, better for productivity. So today, just as a matter of example, we in one of our jobs in the UK, we don't use any more people to erect segmental rings on the TBM. It's fully automatized. So, and this, I mean, the industry keeps moving, and there is a lot we can do.
Thanks, CEDA. John, CEDA raises an interesting point around the skills piece. And obviously, as you mentioned, we've got this macro issue of 105,000 workers short. But then we've got an issue around the types of skills and capabilities that we have in the sector. And then we've got a whole cultural issue, which I know that you've had a task force looking into the cultural issues in the sector. How do you think about each of those parts of building the capability of the workforce and having the right sort of culture and diversity in the workforce?
Yeah, I mean, culture's a huge thing. We recognise that is one of the three key pillars of a sustainable construction industry, doing something about culture. And I was really pleased to hear Ron call out the culture standard. I mean, that's something that we recognising the importance of that particular issue. The CICT was set up, New South Wales Government, Victorian Government and ourselves, ACA, to look at that, but importantly to get expert advice on this, because we build stuff. How do you change the culture of an industry? We're not the best people to talk to about that. We need to get some help from externals around that, and that's exactly what we've done. We've got some assistance from academia around what are the things that you really need to do to change, and that has guided the formation of really quite a groundbreaking culture standard that's just in the process of being finalised as we speak. We're looking to, as in the CICT, is looking to trial the culture standard on 6 major projects starting from the middle of this year. And it's looking at 3 key areas. It's looking at time for life. Should we reduce the amount of hours that we work, our people? Absolutely. Can we reduce that to 5 days a week? Also looking at diversity and inclusion, the 12% stat I mentioned earlier, and a lot of these things are obviously interlinked. And then the final part of the standard is focused on wellness. So this is a lot of things around mental health. How do we improve the mental health of our workforce and address that shocking suicide statistic? So there was a lot of consultation around this culture standard end of last year and into the start of this year. That feedback is now being incorporated into and the standard finalised. And as I say, hopefully we'll be starting some trial projects quite soon.
All right, another call for pigeonhole questions. There's plenty of room, so please jump in and ask questions. Bede, you sort of touched on issues around efficiency of staffing on projects. What do you see in terms of how the industry allocates resources and management in projects? Are there opportunities there to change the way that we staff up projects?
Yeah, massive opportunity. I think there was mentioned earlier about who should start the new paradigm of change, and clients or the. But the truth of it is, we've all got to be a part of change, and it's not that Transport for New South Wales or the equivalent another has particular views. There's a whole world of challenge that goes to why there are barriers to why we've got an org chart that's got 500 people on a job instead of 300 people, why we're not getting more women into the industry, why the design is massively conservative in Australia compared to the opportunities what we see in other parts of the world, such as just building in Australia. And our own businesses have got to be thinking about, yes, we need more people, but when our org structures are so big, generally about 16% of direct cost, and you go to a vertical construction site and they're at about 2% of direct cost. You go, reasonable opportunity in your own business to change that. So there's just a sort of the whole industry has this sort of barriers that we build up. You don't know you do it, but it's just the nature, and it's probably the nature of most industries, that you protect yourself. And it just creates a real hardship of change. This is how we do it. You don't understand, Bede, that's just how we do it. Whether it be the construction terms, our sizes of our project teams, the designers coming up with really conservative designs when they're perfectly intelligent and well-educated people who can do it differently. So, I feel that as the leaders in the industry, I think you've just got to say freedom, free things up to allow people to actually become the better managers, the better designers, the better employers that we can be. So the more restrictions there are, the less ability is for free. I say to my people, if Elon Musk come into our industry, and we all know he has started a tunnelling company, don't know how well it's going, But just from a process flow point of view, he just wouldn't do, I don't think he would do the same process flows that we do. Why have we still got purchase process flows, the same as what the Romans invented 2,500 years ago? You know, when we've got data that can just match stuff up. You know, and so we're employing accounts payable teams and process flows, and dockets still on people's desks from, you know, borrowed concrete suppliers. So, yeah, this is sort of stuff that I know Guy and his teams are working on. To me, every part of our industry, not just how quickly we can dig a hole, is a massive opportunity for us to improve, to create better environments for people to work in, which will encourage a hell of a lot more diversity and a lot more women and people from all different backgrounds to come and work with us. But just having the bravery of leaders to every single day ask, why not? Why can't we change? Why can't we free things up? That is where we're going to get to, because we tend to focus on that issue, say gender, which we want to, or time for life, or whatever, but the reality is it's just the freeing up the barriers, which I think, and the challenge of people to just change their mindset, is really at the highest level of what we've got to do.
Thanks, Bede, and my apologies to everyone. You have been submitting questions on Pigeonhole and I have not been receiving them, so you're probably wondering why you've been voting on a lot of questions and asking them, and I have not been asking them, so my apologies for that, which I will get to promptly now. We do have another anonymous question that has 9 votes, and I guess it goes to a little bit the points before that we've been talking about around whether it's collaboration, a focus on outcomes, and I guess a little bit of a reality check on that. And I'll come to you first, Saved, on this, but I want to hear from everyone. The politicisation of infrastructure means that we put the cart before the horse, announcing and funding projects before they are planned. How can cost effectiveness be improved in this setting?
Look, that's a difficult question, but it's all about preparation. It's the technical preparation, but also all the stakeholder management, EIS, like Bede mentioned earlier. All of this preparation is very important, and we can see that also what affects the ability for the contractors to deliver well is the packaging of big infrastructure contracts. So in fact, sometimes the client refrain from doing the coordination and will be tempted to have a big package, to award a big package that includes nearly everything. And that, in fact, on large infrastructure project pushes the contractors to form very large teams of 3, 4, 5 joint venture partners. And that is, I would say, it makes the productivity at management level already much more difficult than if the packages were split and the coordination done by the owner, by the project owner. So in fact, by doing a bit of investment in the coordination, the project owner can gain in the efficiency of the team globally, if you want. So that's also in the preparation upfront, because we can see that for the same project, a major infrastructure project, it can start as a PPP and then go to a $100 DNC and then a more collaborative type of contract, ITC, and it goes through all of this, and the packaging evolves from one large package to different packages. And I think there is a large difference in the outcome during delivery.
Bede, I guess a lot of this, you know, where the rubber hits the road, I guess, on collaboration and outcomes focus is also around risk. Yep. And a related question here in Pigeonhole is there enough time spent on identifying and allocating project risk between government and contractors? What's your view on that, and how do we start to do a better job in terms of risk?
Well, yeah, often there is not. Often there is not enough time, and I think it goes to that just last question also of what we can do to change that and get change happening earlier. And I think risk identification early can occur with collaboration early. So I do feel that there is, the more that a brave client can actually get involved well ahead of the EIS starting, the planning approval starting, is where that exploration of what real risk is in the construction environment. And bearing in mind that the construction environment now, as I think Peter pointed out earlier, is really about, in urban environments, the totality of the stakeholder risk, which is a lot more about voters. We live in a first world democracy, so we're never going to change, and we don't want to change the fact that we have elections and governments will change and society will change their mind about a particular piece of infrastructure. But I don't think that means that you can't actually get a construction team holistically involved well ahead of the game to identify those risks, work through all of the scenarios that could turn the project from a $2 billion job to a $1 billion job, or identify there's going to be a $3 billion job early on, as the case may be. And that, to me, is the answer to these things. Get involved earlier, be brave, and procurement agencies need to think, if we're not going to have this hard dollar tender, how do we evaluate contractors? So it's basically just, let's get into the 2022 and work out the tools to evaluate who are the best teams, who are the best contractors, in all of the ways we want to, rather than rely on something that was invented, as I said, 2,500 years ago by the Romans.
Just a follow-up question on that, Bede, because it is coming in on Pigeonhole, top of the votes. Noting the value of engaging contractors early, how do we address the issue of probity, conflicts of interest, of prior engagement, preventing future bidding being managed for these projects?
Well, again, for starters, I'd say you've actually got to rethink the whole process. So I'm not suggesting that you get us involved and then you go to tender. I'm suggesting you get us involved and be brave enough to follow it through. And you have processes of evaluation that are way more sophisticated than the pretty dumb way that's just done who's the cheapest in the box.
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Bede said there, I mean, that question's predicated on the fact that, on the assumption that value for money is lowest possible price, maximum risk transfer at the tender box. And how long have we been doing that, and how long have we seen that just doesn't drive the best outcomes? And so we need to move beyond that. We need to look at a more collaborative approach, and that doesn't have to be, I mean, when I say that, people automatically assume, you contractors, all you want is alliances. It doesn't have to be alliances. There are other ways of doing procurement and delivery far more collaboratively that doesn't have to be, full open book alliance style projects. And we just need to get out of this mindset of lowest price equals value.
So I'm going to keep going with the Pigeonhole questions and stick with you, John, on this. And I seem to have generated 14 questions, so I've outdone myself there. Should have got onto them earlier. John, there's a question: what would have prevented the recent contractors going into administration? You didn't know you were going to get this one, did you?
How long have we got? One easy thing would be rise and fall provisions in contracts. I mean, one of the biggest pressures on contractors currently is the increasing cost of resources that no one could have foresaw. I mean, a lot of these projects are bid 2 to 3, it takes 2 to 3 years from bidding a job to seeing it through. And a hell of a lot can change in that period of time. And we've seen exactly that happening. We've seen, if you were bidding a project 3 years ago, hands up who would have put anything in for pandemic risk. And yet here we are, especially in the commercial sector, where these contractors are left carrying the can for this, not just in terms of the shutdowns that happen down here in Sydney and in Melbourne. And if they don't make that time back up, hey, they're even up for liquidated damages just to rub the salt into the wounds a little bit more. And they're up for these increasing cost in materials caused by things like the increase in oil price, but the logistical issues that we've had as well. So we've had all this coming together. Thankfully, in the government sector, in the infrastructure sector, governments have by and large sort of said, well, we need to help you out here. We're governments, we can't afford to see you fail, and they've stepped in and helped industry out. But in the commercial sector, it's the opposite. You've got developers, and even I see we've got some super funds in the room as well that are investing in property, and they've done their sums based on certain metrics, and they're not a charity. They can't afford to necessarily bail these contractors out. But that is exactly the problem that we've seen. And the other thing about rise and fall is it's not just about protecting clients. I was mentioning this to someone the other day. It's protecting clients as well, because if you're pricing a job at the moment and you're pricing it based on oil at well over $100 a barrel, and hopefully, we see a resolution to the issues in Ukraine sometime soon, and that pressure on oil drops significantly, the contractor has locked in a price based on that high value. Is it right that that contractor should make a windfall gain out of it? It works both ways. And we used to have these rise and fall provisions probably about 10 years ago now, I think was the last time they were around. We really need to get them back into contracts pretty soon.
All right. We do have a question here which I want to ask to everyone, but I'll start with you, Sved. Taking the fear out of change is not easy. I've heard all this great talk for at least the last 15 years. I absolutely agree, but why will there be change this time? And I guess we'll see who's an optimist or perhaps a pragmatic optimist on our panel here as well.
You mean change in terms of collaborativeness or collaboration?
Yep.
That's you? Okay. So look, for sure, in front of the risks that John just mentioned, rise and fall and other construction risk, I mean, we're very keen to take the risk we can ascertain and manage. But surely, as you mentioned earlier, private developers may be less ready to help the contractors out. But still, I mean, the client wants a project, he wants to build an infrastructure, and there are risks that the industry can take and risks that is impossible for the industry to take. So this needs to be recognized by the developer or the client eventually. Now, in terms of model, I think we've seen last year a number of contracts which were designed in New South Wales or Victoria, which were designed initially as a hard dollar DNC, moved to incentivized target cost. I think it's very encouraging for the industry because that does not prevent that we have to perform. This is only a target. There is a pain share, gain share mechanism around it. So no question, we have to perform in safety, in productivity, in delivering on time and to a budget. But at least it's a good model when unforeseen events occur, and also it's a model that is deemed to promote early resolution of issues between client and contractors rather than protracted, I would say, dispute process or long-time argument, because we have no time on the project and it's very disruptive to have to deal with difficult commercial subjects which are not resolved, and also this can be detrimental to acceleration measures, to change of design that are beneficial to the project. So you were asking about changes. I think we've seen changes last year. And if I had one ask to, let's say, government agencies, is we want to see that mindset of incentivized target cost materializing at teams level. And I think that is very important, because we can have whatever contract model we wish. If the mindset is not there from both sides, contractor and client, then we will still struggle and not have the early resolution of issues. So I think we've seen changes, and we need the mindset to be there from both teams, I would say.
Bede, how do you see this time being different? And you have expressed, some, I think, optimism about the capability and determination within the sector. What do we need to do to make sure that this time is different?
Well, the last 5 years has been incredible change. We started off the Construction Industry Leadership Forum about 5 years ago, the Construction Industry Culture Task Force, And our organisation, we now have, I think, 64 to 70% of our work in hand is in what I call relationship contracts. As John mentioned, different forms of, there's alliances, there's incentivised target costs. Queensland has a different name for their slightly different model. So, 70% of our work in hand is in those relationship contracts. That was not possible 5 years ago. So absolutely there's already been some very, very positive change. The fact that these conversations are happening very regularly is also another part of the change. There is not a forum where you have the Australian Contractors Association members talking to government where culture, diversity and commercial terms, they're all front and centre every single time. So that's really, really the key. I just feel that there's another step. As Saved said before, the driver now is clearly going to be sustainability. We must become a far more conscious industry, top to bottom, of our carbon output, and society's going to drive that. So if you're not steering the wheel there, you're going to be left behind real quick. And it's obvious that greater flexibility is at the heart of getting much better outcomes from a carbon perspective in our industry. We're one of the biggest users of carbon, vertical building and infrastructure combined, and so we can have the biggest impact, and it needs us to be more unshackled again in order to get those breakthrough changes, which we can do and which are happening elsewhere in the world.
Maybe just to pick up on your point around relationship contracts, because there's a couple of questions relating to this in Pigeonhole, including one from Lauren Jewell. Are you seeing a shift in government appetite towards greater collaboration between designers, contractors and government to get better outcomes? And are you seeing particular government agencies really leading on this?
Oh, absolutely. Victoria was definitely the lead, and the level crossing removal program has been, without doubt, the lead there. Each state now, like WA didn't have alliances, now we've got 3 big alliances in Western Australia. It's fantastic. Queensland, we've just been, got another project, I'm not sure if it's public, so I've got to be careful. I think we've just been successful there on our second significant relationship contract. So there's no one model that is perfect, so it's going that way for sure. It's another level of mindset. I think what happens in leadership is you get good conversation, policy settings are changing. It's the next levels down. When I talk to my people, they say, "Bede, we understand what you're saying," and I know when you speak to Camilla or Corey Hannett, you have those great conversations, but you don't understand 3 or 4 levels down, we get the barriers again. So we just got to keep at it. Just keep at it. Be patient. Work at it. Just keep saying the same thing, and you might get 3 wins, 1 win out of 4. You're going to have 3 times your knockback, but keep having the conversation to break down the barriers and get that design changed. And whether it be in the designers or in the clients, we just got to persist at that change.
John, do you want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, look, I mean, Bede's right. The change is coming. I think the key is that this isn't just what we see all the time. It cycles in the market. At the minute, it's deemed a contractors market, and therefore everyone thinks, well, to get the contractors interested, we've got to go down the collaborative contracting route. We should be choosing the form of contract to deliver a project based on the particular circumstances around that project. Yeah. Not whether it's a contractor's market or it's not a contractor's market. We should be looking, there's perfect times for lump sum D&C or lump sum hard dollar, and there'll always be times when that is the best route to go, and there'll be times when a more collaborative approach is the best way to go. We really need to be more sophisticated about the procurement method that we choose for a particular project.
I want to come to, we've got 5 minutes left. I want to see if we can get through some more questions. And this one's for Bede and Saved. The red tape is huge in recruitment process with large contractors. Too much bureaucracy in internal teams holding on to jobs unfilled as they are targeted on dollars. What are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. That's our own company. Yeah. So we've got barriers that our own company builds. Governance of our own businesses get in the way of actually being more flexible and lean. So we are absolutely got our own challenges to say, how do I know I get people say, "But are you aware that it takes 3 weeks now for us to actually recruit and onboard after we've selected them, just to actually get them started work?" It does my head in. So then I've got to find out, well, what is the process we put in place to do that? So, that's what I say, it's not easy, but you just got to have, in my view, consistently look and understand and unpack and tell your people, stop telling me why you can't do it. Let's work out what we can do. And it goes in every organisation. So absolutely, those barriers exist in our company.
All right.
Probably one of my managers who asked that question. I got no idea.
It was from Anonymous. I can
I've got an idea who it might have been.
Question for the panel, and it's interesting that this hasn't really come up until now. What changes would you like to see to planning and environmental approvals? Let's start with you, John.
I looked up at the wrong time there, didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
It goes back to what Bede was saying. Bede raised an example, and I've heard it a number of times, where contractors get brought in, the stage that contractors get brought into the planning and approval process, by the time they come in, the EOI is done. And it's just too hard, too costly, and too timely to change it, even though there's potentially hundreds of millions of dollars of savings on some of the examples I've heard. Hundreds of millions of dollars of savings, and we're going, nah, it's too hard. That tells you there's something wrong with the process.
Yeah, well, that's I gave that example earlier. Yeah, it's a project being built now, which we offered 20% less, but it was a multi-billion-dollar project, and it couldn't be done. I think it was a much better permanent outcome, and certainly much more efficient, but it was just it was too late.
We do have another question that relates to a point that you made, Bede, so I'll direct that one your way. Big projects can take 20 plus years to reach construction. You raised the constraints of early planning not enabling innovation during design. How do we stop interpolating history to meet our future needs?
Can you repeat that? How do we
stop interpolating history to meet our future needs? So I think continuing to do the same thing in terms of projects.
Well, I love the example earlier. I think Guy made it about thinking how much copper is needed for the amount of transmission lines that is needed to be built in order for the renewable energy. That's actually the same here in Australia. We're a very, very large renewable energy developer and owner and operator globally and also in Australia. And one of the biggest barriers is the transmission lines here. So, and we're about to tender for one lot of transmission line. I think Australia probably needs about 100 times of that one transmission line. So we probably need about $30 or $40 billion of transmission lines built in Australia. Hadn't thought of it the way Guy just mentioned it then, but it's the truth. There is going to be massive barriers. So is it a smart thing to have another 50 different procurements for those transmission lines? Or should the government be getting us involved, or a bunch of contractors, or a bunch of, call it consortiums, because the whole thing needs more than just construction companies. We obviously need really good designers. We need various people who can work with stakeholders, obviously extremely good environmental consultants. So there's teams that need to come together to get outcomes there, and they're all in rural environments. So that is a classic example of how we need to stop doing the same thing and start a different way of how we're going to get to this world where we're going to be at zero carbon by 2050 or earlier, if possible.
Well, we have come to time, but I think that's a really good note to end on in terms of imagining different challenges and challenging the way that we do things in response. Could you please join with me in thanking the panel for their participation and great insights today. You will be pleased to know that you are going to get a break from me, and Melinda Salento is going to come back to the stage for our next session, which is a conversation with Kate West, the co-chair of Australasia Arup, who's going to be joining us virtually from Perth.
Well, welcome back to, well, I don't know, who am I welcoming back? I've lost my train of thought here. We are now going to be joined by Kate West, co-chair Australasia Arab, and hopefully I'm going to see her on the screen shortly. We're going to have a 15-minute conversation on the topic of resilience. There you are, Kate. So nice to see you. So the topic of this session is looking at the role of resilience, if you like, in thinking about value in infrastructure projects. We're going to jump straight into it because we've got 15 minutes only, Kate, and thank you so much for making your time available over in WA. Resilience is a term I think that we use a lot, and we use it pretty broadly, I think, which means it can mean sort of everything and nothing, if you like. So, Kate, I'm interested in what you think resilience looks like, and what does it mean for you in the context of today's conversation and driving better value through infrastructure?
Great, thanks Melinda, and great to be here with you all, albeit virtually, as you say. Look, resilience for me means the ability to withstand and adapt to changing conditions and to really recover positively from shocks and stresses. But you're right, Melinda, it is a broad term, and there's a risk in talking about resilience that we speak at such high level that we miss focusing on those practical actions we need to take. And I do want to get this morning to some of those practical actions, but as you say, we need to start at the high level to define the imperative to address resilience, particularly in this context of value and infrastructure that we're talking about today. And I'm really keen to talk about the role we can collectively take as leaders in this space. So as I said, we talk about resilience as this ability to withstand, adapt to, recover from shocks and stresses, and there's no doubt across the world we're experiencing these shocks and stresses at an ever-increasing rate. Digital change, the climate change, pandemic, geopolitical uncertainty, all these factors are playing out around us. And I think if the last couple of years has taught us anything, it's that these major change events are growing more frequent and in many ways less predictable. And the stats are confronting us. Just looking over the weekend, indicators such as the IMF World Uncertainty Index shows a rapidly increasing rate of global disruption over the past 30 years. The Resilient Shift, an organisation I'd be keen to talk about a bit this morning, quotes that climate-related disasters have cost the world $650 billion US over the last 3 years. And Infrastructure Australia notes that by 2050, the cost of natural disasters in Australia will more than double from 18 billion to 39 billion. So look, I think, significant change, and I've heard that theme coming through this morning, significant change. And we see these shocks and stresses impacting our infrastructure, which we rely on so fundamentally as society. So I think to this question of value, I think the real value is looking at what our infrastructure does. This question of the services that it performs, what happens when these stresses that we're talking about accumulate or sudden events occur that disrupt performance. So instead of creating fail-safe individual infrastructure assets, which we've done very well, I think, historically, I think we do need to shift and develop and operate infrastructure systems that contribute to our overall resilience as a society. And just a quote that I've read from the Resilience Shift, there's this nice saying that they focus on society. Society deserves safe, sustainable and resilient infrastructure. The communities around us are calling for it, and future generations depend on it. So I think, in a nutshell, Melinda, that's probably my broad take on this question of what resilience is in infrastructure.
Thanks, Kate. And there's a lot in that. I wanted to sort of draw some threads back to some of the conversation we've already had this morning. And one of them does, I think, go to how we do value projects, and this issue about looking at a project from a cost perspective as distinct from looking at the value that it creates and the value of the project overall. When you're thinking about resilience, I think often that means looking longer term at a project, building in contingency, building in optionality. That can come with greater cost up front. How do we build that into a project? How do we value resilience literally in a project? And how do we sort of get people thinking about the distribution of, who pays for it when?
No, it's a great question, Melinda, and I think it probably really is at the heart of the conversation, because we need to be able to value it, and we need to be able to value it, I think, in a consistent way across the work we do, both government and private sector. So I think it is worth acknowledging there is no universally agreed methodology or even guidance on how to value resilience in infrastructure decision making. And I think we are seeing individually organisations and businesses quantify risk at that individual asset level and build this into the planning, into the financial decision-making frameworks, the business cases that we look at for the projects. But I think to take this idea of resilience as a system, to take it up a level, as I mentioned at the start, to value not just the resilience of each individual asset, but the contribution of the infrastructure to our overall resilience as a society, requires a much broader lens. And I think then it requires a much more integrated view of value in essence, which is going to take a shift. It's going to take a shift in collaboration. I heard that theme coming through in the session before, and a shift in leadership from all of us across government and industry. And I think we do need to create a culture that values resilience. I think that is an important shift to make. But I do think we need to agree a nationally consistent approach to quantifying risk in investment decisions and frameworks. So I think in this context, it is also important to consider the cost of failing to be resilient. We're talking a bit lately about this cost of loss, and the Lloyd's City Index have done some great work and look beyond the direct costs of rebuilding and found, the substantial indirect costs associated with losing infrastructure and the provision of services that they perform. And we know that the loss of services affects businesses, communities and the broader economy. We've certainly seen that over the last couple of years through the climate change impacts we're facing and also through COVID. So I think this question of total value, the total value of infrastructure damage, is then substantially higher than the direct replacement costs that we face. And the infrastructure resilience shift estimates that for every $1 we spend on infrastructure adaptation, there's a fourfold return on benefit. So certainly I think on the sort of requirement side, there is the need and there's the imperative to put a value on this. But I do think we need to pull our thinking up and focus more on the systems that we're providing rather than the individual assets. And we do need to look across the full project life cycle, across the planning, financing, design, delivery, operations and maintenance phase of our infrastructure to really capture the full value that resilience can offer. And Infrastructure Australia, I think actually, Romilly, I think you're in the room today. IA has done some great work and promoted the value in looking at resilience at this early planning stage, at the decision-making stage where we set the fundamental principles of our infrastructure, where we're choosing our sites, where we're creating interdependencies with other assets, so that we can start to put a value on infrastructure that properly shares the cost, to your point, Melinda, shares the cost up front across the bodies, across the agencies that will benefit from that resilience in the long term. So look, there's no doubt valuing resilience is hard. It's not an easy thing to look at this systems level, to look at the lifespan, to look at these sort of 50-year payback periods that often we're talking about. But there is some good work happening. I was just reading through some of the Coalition for Resilient Investment work in the climate space, and they're certainly driving a cross-industry, cross-sector discussion. And then I know a number of private agencies, IFM I think are here today, private investors are doing great work regarding risk and resilience and really putting this long-term view, this long-term value on resilience into the cost equation up front in our financial frameworks and investment decision making processes.
It really seems like it's pulling, this concept of resilience is actually pulling together a lot of the topics that we've already touched on today, if you like. I mean, thinking about collaboration, how you share expertise, looking beyond just the phase of contracting right here, right now, and the project build, and thinking about different scenarios, if you like, and sort of risk testing what you're doing and actually really having a much deeper conversation around risk and where that risk sits. And even thinking about Guy's comment about, where is your supply chain? And if you're talking about one project that sits within a system of projects, how you're thinking about that. I'm going to take you on a slightly different topic, if I can, Kate, picking up one of the questions which has come through. And I think it's another topic that we've sort of talked about but haven't really put the resilience lens on, if you like, which is diversity. And ways of working, and there's been a lot said this morning already about the lack of diversity, the challenges around wellbeing at the construction site and the like. And the question was put, the comment was made about moving to more friendly working hours, if you like, 5 days a week. But the question that's come through on the pigeonhole is, do we actually need to think about resilience around making work sustainable 24/7? And how do we think about that? So a very different sort of take on it, if you like.
No, it's a great question. And look, I think this question of human resilience is really front of mind at the moment. Certainly the last couple of years have been really challenging. I mean, for all of us, probably all of us here in the room today, but particularly for the people in our organisations and that are part of the work that we do in infrastructure. And I know certainly, you know, there's challenges. The way our construction sector, the way our professional services sector has worked has been challenging in terms of embracing these questions of diversity. And certainly I think a great opportunity for us is to shift the ways of working to really look at this question of how to make work more sustainable, how to make it more attractive across a whole range of different people to allow us to be successful as an industry. So no, look, I think there's lots of work we can do there, from, you know, testing our 6-day construction, working on site sort of, you know, activity cycle, to allowing more flexibility in terms of how we set up our roles and how we allow people to work. And actually, I think my co-chair, Karen, is in the room today with you, and certainly at Arup, you know, right from the top, we've looked at different ways of structuring roles, structuring the way that we work to allow greater diversity and inclusion. And the way that Karen and I have set up our role as co-chairs leading Arup across Australasia allows just that.
And we've certainly had conversations about that, and how interesting that model is that the two of you have got going. We'll bring you back to have a deeper conversation about that. We've got a little bit of time left. I know one of the things that you've spoken about before, or interested in, is a different approach to resilience. We talk a lot about climate risk and the resilience of infrastructure and what we can do about that. And I think the issue of nature-based solutions is something that's being spoken about more. How do you think the nature-based solutions can offer value and new ways of thinking around projects and resilience?
Yeah, no, great question, Melinda. And I think, look, nature-based solutions, a term many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with in the audience today, really looks at sort of sustainable management, the use of nature to tackle both social and environmental challenges, and can really include a diverse range of techniques to address climate impacts, whilst also supporting regeneration of ecosystems and decarbonising the built environment. So I think there's a real opportunity for us as an industry to shift the way that we're designing. We've historically looked often at sort of hard design solutions, but we're evolving now as an industry and looking at this sort of cross-section of physical solutions, maybe seawall design to stave off floods, with natural solutions such as blue-green flood management, and operational responses that really look at disaster responses, recovery plans. And I think that sort of intersection of different design solutions, bringing together not just hard design, but these nature-based solutions that can really have this double sort of benefit of addressing climate change whilst at the same time providing greater resilience to the shocks and impacts of climate change that we're experiencing in the sector is a huge opportunity. So really keen to see us expand and develop our nature-based solutions as an industry.
Well, Kate, I knew that the time was going to whip through, and I think unfortunately we are out of time. I know you're a big fan of talking about the resilient shift, so people can take time to sort of look that up for themselves and learn more about that. But thank you so much for giving us a really action-packed 15 minutes and plenty to think about and plenty of insights, and we look forward to welcoming you to the CEDA stage again soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Belinda. Great to be here.
Well, it is time to move quickly on to our next session. The next session is titled Paradigm Shift, Competition to Collaboration, something we've already talked a lot about on the stage, but we're going to get a state-based perspective. Joining me on stage are the chief executives from 3 of our state infrastructure bodies. In person, we've got Simon Draper, the Chief Executive of Infrastructure New South Wales, Dr. Jonathan Spears, the Chief Executive of Infrastructure Victoria, and Jeremy Conway, who is the Chief Executive of Infrastructure South Australia. And then joining us on the video link, we've got Philip Hellberg, who is the Chief Executive of Infrastructure WA. We're doing a little iPad shift here. Now we've got 4 fantastic speakers who are going to bring great perspectives to this conversation, and we've got probably about 45 minutes together, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of questions from the audience to our panellists. I just wanted to give you a quick sort of outline of the issues that we thought that we would touch on, so that you've got some idea of the questions you might want to feed in, or feel free to throw in something completely different. But we thought we really wanted to, of course, talk on the topic of productivity and collaboration, resilience in the context of natural disasters and sustainability, and if we've got time we're going to try to swing back and talk about skills, which I'm sure is an issue on the minds of many of you in the audience. But let's get started with productivity and collaboration. And Philip, I'm going to warn you, I'm coming to you first just to make sure we don't forget you on the screen. So Infrastructure Australia, of course, has released its new report, Transforming Infrastructure Delivery. That report recommends the development of jurisdictional infrastructure interdependency strategies, which I think means you guys should all work together more to enable and guide integrated planning and delivery and operation of solutions, whole of system. Philip, what does that mean for the state infrastructure bodies, and how can you best align your work with the outputs of others in this recommendation?
Thanks, Melinda, and g'day everyone. Look, I think to a large extent that's happening already. I think Romilly referred to the fact earlier that I think the infrastructure bodies has a very close working relationship. We share ideas, we have input into other bodies' work, and when you look at our strategies, I think you will find there's a constant thread and theme on various topics throughout those strategies. I think a very important a way for us to also look at how we can, in a practical sense, influence this interdependency is through the assessment of project proposals. So when you look at these early proposals of major projects, that's where I guess infrastructure bodies can really ask those questions around interdependencies. How does this particular proposal speak to perhaps other projects, other sectors outside of the proposal? And I guess how can things be considered around interdependency, digital innovation, procurement models, all the things that we've already spoken about today. I think that's a practical lever that infrastructure bodies do have to try and address this issue.
Anything to add from?
Yeah, look, I might add a few things, and yeah, there's certainly excellent collaboration between all the I bodies, and that sort of consistency that Phil was describing. There's also probably a layer deeper when it comes to interdependencies, and we need to probably start getting a little more specific, and I think that's what at least some of the call here from IA is about. And so let me give you a couple of examples. So interdependencies across the whole economy is a really big thing and a big beast for us to take on. So perhaps what we want to do is get more specific. So, for example, integration of transport and land use planning is a really clear example of at the front end when we're doing planning and we're thinking about our transport planning, also looking at, well, what is the effect and the interplay between transport and land use? And there's some good examples of what's being done, of course, in Sydney with some of that precinct level and area level planning, or at Infrastructure Victoria, what we've done is we've done integrated transport and land use modelling. So we know what the interplay is between them. I think the other bit, we just talked about resilience in the previous session. So that's where we're increasingly seeing that interplay between different sectors. And we need to get beyond high-level mapping to some prioritisation about what are the highest risks from climate risk in each jurisdiction and across jurisdictions. And in addressing those risks, what are some of the best ways to do that actually cross across sectors? Because that's going to help us be more resilient, and that helps us really get to the bottom of this interplay between sectors.
I might have a slightly contrarian view that I do agree that we have great collaboration across the eye bodies, but I think COVID's demonstrated how effective our federation cannot work at times in terms of trying to get everyone and all the jurisdictions aligned on the same goal. So I think that's the challenge. I think the important role for an eye body isn't necessarily to take the politics out of investment decisions, but it's to make sure that they're well informed. Ultimately, it's the politicians who make the decisions, and so it's going to be very hard for me to convince the Minister in New South Wales that they might need to delay their project to benefit our project. So I think the best thing that we can do is try and ensure that those pipelines are as transparent as possible. And so industry and governments can help plan around because there's an understanding of what's coming on in other jurisdictions, and so we can plan our own pipelines. I think it's a very laudable ambition, and I'd fully support it if we can get there. I think the harsh reality of our federation is it's hard to get to that end goal, but transparent pipelines, I think, will go a long way to allow industries to plan their resources around that.
Yeah, look, I think I agree with that point. Harder to collaborate across governments where ultimately the executive government's making their own decisions, but doesn't mean we don't try at an officials level, and also that our elected officials also do work together very effectively, and that can go well at times and not so well at other times, depending on what's happening. But I think, you know, the critical thing, I think Jonathan sort of mentioned, just getting that level of integration and decision making within a jurisdiction is not that straightforward. I think in New South Wales now, the idea that you'd go out and announce some major project without thinking about the impacts on other sectors, so building a new transport project without thinking through the land use plan that sits behind that, without thinking about what around those transport hubs are schools and other state infrastructure and council infrastructure going to be available, what the land use controls say about use of land in those areas. If you're not thinking about that in New South Wales, you're not thinking the way that everyone else in New South Wales thinks now, and it's probably the biggest challenge with the sort of recommendations that we all deliver and that Rom and Peter and others have released today, is turning those things into action on the ground, and probably the best way to do that is to change the culture within your own organisations. So culturally now, our people would not. We would often have breakdowns of this, but our agencies would not consider it acceptable to go out alone and pursue a project without having worked with other agencies who might be affected by it.
Mm. I'm going to jump in with an early question because I think it relates a lot to what we've been talking about, which is a bit of the infrastructure, if you like, of collaboration, which is, you know, how important is information and data sharing? We've probably seen that through COVID, that we've seen a lot more sharing of information, including across jurisdictions. Is that something that we need to see more of? How fundamental is it, and where do you think we're at the moment? And I'll look for someone who looks eager to jump in on this.
I'm happy to start on it, Linda. There's some good work being done by IA or also IPA about getting data together on different projects across Australia. I think that's a good start. But for me, one of the most powerful things is the examples of great practice. And, you know, we looked, you know, to what Simon's been describing in terms of good ways in which government can collaborate amongst itself to get planning done. Others look to the level crossing removal authorities' approach to procurement as a program and an alliance. And so that kind of information sharing is really powerful for us, because in most instances these challenges that we've got aren't, you know, unique to us. It's just others have had a crack at it, and we'd be silly not to learn from it.
And I think that's one of the real benefits of the iBody network and how well we collaborate. It fosters that information exchange to learn from best practice.
Philip, anything you want to throw in there?
Yeah, look, Melinda, I would say it's absolutely essential. In our recent strategy that we published, we pointed it out specifically as an issue, not just within government, the issue of sharing information, but also between government and the private sector. If you think about it in a WA context, with the absolute dominance perhaps of the resource industry in terms of the share of capital investment in infrastructure, it's essential that we get this balance right around when the timing of investment, when we pull the trigger from a government perspective versus industry. You know, we're currently dealing with issues in terms of market capacity, and perhaps that's something we haven't quite got the balance right yet. but also in terms of the work that we do as infrastructure bodies, doing long-term infrastructure planning. Having done that now for a couple of years, it's extremely challenging if you don't have the right information, and if you don't have the right information across the board and the integration between the data sets. So if you can't join the dots using this information, it becomes extremely challenging, and it just limits the quality, I guess. So the better the data, the better the quality of the data, the more connected it is, the better we will get in terms of long-term planning on infrastructure.
So I'm going to pick up a question here that's come through, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, because it does go exactly to this question that we've just been talking about sharing information and knowledge. But there's an implicit question around whether there's a fear of transparency. And it sort of links to some of the comments from previous conversations around, genuine collaboration actually requires complete transparency and honesty. Do you think we're there?
I think we probably need to think about this in two contexts. A lot of the discussions we've been having has been in the contracting, procurement, built infrastructure delivery, and maybe the other guys might be better off to talk about that. Yeah. When it comes to transparency about strategic planning and evidence base, that's something I would say Infrastructure Victoria has been core to what we do. It is core to our value. We publish every single technical report we have. We publish our evidence base so that others can use it and see it and not have to replicate it. And that improves confidence in long-term decision making. And it also means that you are, to a degree, vulnerable, because you open yourself up to people questioning you and testing you. And that's good, because it means we give better advice and we're open to changing our minds. And so I think at the strategic planning level or the policy setting level, transparency of our underpinning evidence and assumptions is absolutely critical if we want to do better. But I might suggest some of my other colleagues might be better talking about transparency in actually project planning and
I think there's an element of culture change there. I think some of the previous speakers have spoken about it. I think we've had some examples where it's worked well, some where it's probably worked less well. But I think in South Australia, from a client side, I think we're getting more mature in the way how we approach it. Transparency is obviously key to make that sort of contracting model work. We've kind of been on the alliance journey well before COVID, because I think we recognised that your hard money D&Cs were creating an adversarial nature that wasn't positive in driving good value. I can look back on some of our early alliances and they were nowhere near as successful as the current ones are. So there's a bit of a culture change, there's a bit of a journey, but I think it's one that will drive value.
Simon, New South Wales, in my experience, is in other areas has really pushed this and progressed, data sharing and transparency. Where do you think you're at?
Well, it depends. I think it's like Jonathan says, what sort of data are we talking about? We have a data sharing arrangement so there's some work done to aggregate information about the supply side constraints in construction that was done by IA. That all was really sourced from constituent jurisdictions and participants in the industry. And we have arrangements that. Probably the biggest single constraint we have on that is really that under our legislation, our primary obligation for transparency and candour is to the executive government. So we advise Cabinet. So we're putting in information into Cabinet. It's not our information to release publicly or to the industry, and that's just part of the Westminster system of government. So we respect that. So that's sort of at the aggregate level. When you're talking about within projects and within procurement of projects, I know we've talked a lot about moving from competition to collaboration. I actually don't think that's a great way to think about it. We actually do believe in competition, but you collaborate with participants at different times, both from the very beginning of projects and certainly once you're in a project together. But there's a period in which you want participants in the industry competing. And you want to get best value for money for taxpayers, and there's some things they can compete on and some things they definitely should not compete on because they don't know any better than us what some of the risks sitting in the project is. But I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, so there's times to be Transparency does help with competition. You want to give all the participants in a bidding process as much information as possible. To the extent we can, allow them to rely on that information, because that's one of the constraints that we have as well. But I think you want to collaborate with industry generally. We're in sort of repeat business with industry. We're not there for one transaction. We're there year in, year out with industry, and so are they. So we want to develop relationships where we can share information, relationships of trust. They understand our methods of working, but there does come a certain point in the process where competition has to happen to make sure you get good value for money for taxpayers.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I guess my sort of take on joining the dots from this morning is that, and just to pick up the data and transparency, I mean, I think information that allows people to really understand what's being sought and actually really think broadly about that and how they can bring the greatest value to that is sort of the competitiveness point, if you like, but a really strong message around then working collaboratively through the project and really better understanding the whole duration, better understanding resilience and really working through risk and innovation in a collaborative rather than a competitive cost-only way is I guess how I would interpret.
Yeah, we don't want to compete with the industry. We want them to compete with each other. So once we're in a deal with when we're initiating a project, we absolutely, and it's part of our, we've got a if not, why not sort of policy around this. You need to engage heavily with industry before you've even got to the point of deciding what the project looks like, what's the scope, what's the design, how you're going to procure it, what the contract, the risk allocation looks like. All that engagement should be done early with industry. And certainly once you're in delivering a project, we don't want to compete with our partners, we want to be partners with them. But there's a point at which they compete with each other.
I'm going to move on to the topic of resilience. I've got a question here, but then I'm going to piggyback off a question that's come through Pigeonhole as well. I was really interested to understand around how we more effectively evaluate the importance of resilience and bring resilience into infrastructure projects. And the question that's come through on Pigeonhole, which is an extension of that, is from Hamish Barnett from Infrastructure Australia, which says, what's stopping resilience being considered in projects? Philip, I might start with you.
Thanks, Melinda. Look, I think the example's been used in the past. I think we need to start looking at resilience like we did with occupational health and safety. So when you think about the fact that that has become ingrained in everything that we do in industry, whether it's design, the delivery, even through the operations. But very importantly, I think resilience in the early planning stages need to receive specific attention. I think that's where most impact can be made when it comes to resilience. When you think about, whether you think about a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be leveraged, whether you should in fact be building something to respond to it. So that demand management question, how to avoid even having to build infrastructure in the first place. But then looking further to if you have no choice, is there a digital solution? How do you, it's like a risk mitigating exercise. How do you avoid the risk in the first place? But once you've landed on, you have to build something and there will be an impact on the environment, for instance, then you can think about what the best ways would be to mitigate that in those early stages. So I think it's got a place throughout the entire life cycle of an asset, but in particular in that upfront planning stage. I think that's where a lot of the critical decisions can be made around resilience. That doesn't necessarily have to cost a lot of money, but that could have a profound impact further down the track.
Jeremy, are you seeing barriers to addressing resilience and factoring in resilience into projects?
Yeah, I like the safety analogy in the way that safety is now assumed and the way how you approach safety is a safe system sort of approach. So some good analogies there with resilience. I think the challenge that we have, and it's something that we're interested to progress in some of our work over the next year or so, is that whole valuation framework around resilience. The challenge that we find within some of the traditional government frameworks is they'll look at a 1 in 100 year event they'll cost out what the impact would be, but then risk weight it, say it's one of the 100-year, and they bring the value down to so low that it's hard to justify the capital investment that's needed. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in some of this resilience piece, and why it's important to take a systems approach to understand what it is. But some of the capital solutions to try and prevent these extreme weather events are very capital intensive. And it's hard within a increasingly constrained budget environment to make that case. And it's very easy for treasuries in the current environment to kick it down the road and say, well, it's 1 in 100 years, I can deal with it tomorrow. The challenge we have is 1 in 100 years is happening more and more frequently. And so I think we really need to reset how we value these things, and it's not a traditional approach that governments, I think, value some of these capital investments required to address some of these larger 1 in 100 plus events.
I mean, it is a bit of the classic problem of upfront cost and long-term delayed and dispersed benefits. How are the two of you seeing this? I mean, are you seeing that there is a consistency across the way the different eye bodies are thinking about this? Do we need to do more?
I don't know if I've explored well enough just to whether we're all thinking about the same way across the country, but the thing is we are all thinking about it, so that's a good start. And we did do some joint work last year. I think one of the things to remember in resilience is, like in New South Wales, we're spending about, at the moment, it's pretty high, we're at a pretty high level, $25 and $30 billion a year on new infrastructure. But we've got about $400 billion worth of infrastructure. So it's actually the resilience of the stuff that we've already built that we need to worry about the most. That's a little bit boring, going back and putting in asset management practices and we do asset management assurance in New South Wales, only really kicked off in the last couple of years. But going back through and doing effectively a stock take on your assets, on the level of hazard that each of them faces under different scenarios, identifying those that are most vulnerable, and then going back and augmenting, replicating those assets to provide redundancy. It's not, ribbon cutting stuff. It's technology upgrades, it's all this sort of thing. So that's actually the bigger task, I think. But in fact, I'm a little bit less worried about the new assets that are getting built because they go through such a rigorous process of decision making. There are asset classes, types of assets that are built specifically for resilience, dam wall raisings and sea walls and all sorts of things, even emergency facilities, those sorts of things. And they're another class again that you do have to think differently about those because they're not going to have this steady payoff or a steady stream of payoffs. They're going to have a big payoff at some point and nothing in between. So that's a different way of thinking again.
Yeah, and so the work we're doing is very much tied to what Simon was talking about. So actually getting specific about, under a range of scenarios, particularly climate change scenarios, what's the highest risk? Often it will be with existing assets, and what do we need to do about it? I think then, what Phil and Jeremy have talked about in terms of new business cases, I would agree with their comments about that. We don't just pay off the cost of people getting killed or hurt at work. We used to. We don't do that anymore. We haven't done that for decades now. And so there is a mindset change about thinking about the longer run effects that we're going to have if infrastructure doesn't work properly and is lacking resilience. And part of that can be making sure that the assumptions we have, the scenarios we have, are both consistent and realistic.
I like the health and safety analogy as well, because you've seen how much good can be done from sharing best practice, talking about how you're looking at risk, how you're addressing risk and all the rest of it, and we've seen tremendous progress. So I do think it's a good analogy.
It is a good analogy, and I often use that example too about culture change and the way we think about safety at work now, the things we used to allow to happen, as Jonathan was saying, and sort of take it as part of the cost of doing business. The only thing I'd say is that is backed in every state by some very draconian legislation, and you might have to think about whether we need that sort of stuff for some other changes as well.
Yeah, and I think the focus on performance too, and actually being really clear about what your performance objectives are and how you've quantified them, how you're tracking them, sits within this too. So if you're thinking about the performance of existing assets and casting that forward and really measuring yourself on that and bringing people into the conversation and thinking about how you can address the risks as cost effectively as possible. I sort of see that bundled up in the same sort of cultural approach, if you like.
Part of the challenge as well, and John talks about the integration on land use plan and infrastructure planning, is people like to live around areas that are subject to climate risk. Whether it's the coast or whether it's lush green hills which are subject to bushfires, and so that concentration of population around inherently risky areas just magnifies, I think, the risk. And I think we're a long way from having any realistic conversations around retreat policies of should people live or build there. But it's part of the challenge. I think just the nature of the Australian environment and where people want to live increases that risk.
I said we would get to skills if we had time permitting, but there's a bunch of questions coming in that sort of touch on skills and capability, so I'm going to go there now. The question which has polled the most votes is, does the public sector currently have the skills to be strong, intelligent owners, to use Guy's language, and if not, what's required to get there?
I'll jump in at the beginning. I mean, I don't know if this directly addresses the question, but there's the new way that we say we're procuring things takes more effort from both industry and from government. So when we go out and procure, it's sort of, I don't say it's easy, but do a design to up to a certain point, put it out in the market from the D&C basis, and then say it's your problem to deliver it. That's one thing. But if you're having to do, we do construct-only contracts now for some things. We do incentivised target cost contracts or parts of contracts run on that basis. That all requires a lot more diligence and expertise on the part of the public sector to both issue and then manage those contracts and work with contractors and those partners, and consultants as well. So we do have to ramp up. The other thing I'd say is that we have been pretty demanding on ourselves over the last decade. We've put a lot of big projects into the market, delivered a lot of big projects. They're still in delivery, a lot of them, and will be for some time. And so it's sort of, we haven't put pressure on ourselves. There's a sort of an onus on us to make sure that we work with the skill base that we have, and we don't keep just mounting up that pressure on the public sector and on industry. I think we need to think about how we utilise the skills and the resources that we have available to us in the most effective way and in a more of a sequenced way rather than sort of rushing into a lot of projects all at once.
Philip, have you got any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, look, I think back at one of the comments that Guy made earlier in terms of the future of collaboration, and when you think about the essential bit for me in that is that bit about aligning objectives. And if we're going to go down that path, and I do believe, for certain projects that's certainly the way to go. If we're going to be going down that path, I think it's going to require a bit of a change in thinking of around skills as well, and in particular skills then, from a public sector perspective. But I think when we get to that stage, and to an extent we are already, for me it's almost a joint conversation then between all the parties that are part of an alliance or a consortium to talk about skills as part of their upfront discussions and working out jointly what are the skills that we're going to be requiring to deliver this initiative or this project. Because the reality is the public sector in a way competes with the private sector for skills. And I think there's certain limitations that exist within the public sector. And I think when we think differently about how we deliver projects, we think differently around skills. So if KPIs are aligned, it's in everyone's interest to find the right skills to represent all the parties in the alliance. And I think that's where some of the step change might occur. So that's just, I guess, an example of, I think, what we can do to try and shift the dial a bit.
One of the other questions that's come through from Owen Hayford is around tools and guidance and training around procurement. Is it something that we need to see developed more strongly, tools and guidance and training, including working collaboratively with industry?
Well, Potentially, I think. Part of it goes to some of the culture change pieces and how do you enforce that. I think there is a bit of a change in the way how we procure, where we are generally, I think Bede mentioned that 60% of the work in progress is more of an ITC or alliance sort of project. So it's a different form, and as Simon says, it's a lot more intensive on the client side as well as the contractor side if you're entering into those sort of contracts. So there is a requirement to skill up there. Some of the guidance and tools will hopefully make that more efficient. Don't have anything particularly to mind. But.
Jonathan?
I think increasing predictability and standardisation of contracts and the contract models is helpful. And I know there's some work being done in Victoria on that at the moment, and that way not only can we save excellent lawyers like Owen billable hours every time we start a new project, but more value added can be made on making sure that there is that collaboration that goes on. But if we're in a position where everyone understands the standard forms and we're not reinventing that wheel every time, that's probably going to be helpful on the journey.
So there's a question here from Peter Truman, which I think plays into this as well, which is around reducing transaction waste, which I think, in the procurement process, which I think you were going to, Jonathan. But then I'm just wondering, it talks about encouraging continuous improvement. So just talk to me a little bit about how standardisation and that sort of approach actually then also enables continuous improvement.
Well, you've got to review it, right? But what we've learnt in Victoria, for example, over the last years is some lessons about what works and what doesn't work, and we've learnt that across the nation. And to some degree, the report that Rom and Peter were talking about before is a really good encapsulation of some of that. So we're always going to have to periodically review it. But having, say in a Victorian context, having Treasury and Office Projects Victoria hold a central template contract for various different types of agreements and types of ways in which we can deliver it is helpful. And then we should be learning and reviewing from that. But you have to have both.
I think some of the partnering sort of arrangements that have been spoken about ad nauseum so far today, that helps that continuous improvement journey. The old one is quite transactional, and so you do what you do to get your transaction done and you move on. I think if you take a more sophisticated, longer-term partnering arrangement, that gives greater scope for continuous improvement.
Yeah. I think I often wonder about this. I ask my team over here sometimes, why don't we get better productivity growth? One hypothesis I have is that so many of our projects now are so big and complex that you can't replicate the way that Jonathan was referring to. You can't say, I've done this before, I'm going to do this again. Everything is bespoke. It requires higher degrees of investigation and specialised skills and redesign and dealing with communities that haven't had projects in their areas before and doing all of that stuff. It's all new every time, and so you can replicate some of the tasks within it, but the whole project is bespoke. So I think if you shift somewhat to, and this is something we've been saying, try and rebalance our portfolio of investment a little bit so that have more programs. People talk about the level crossing, great example, but having more programs that are replicated in there, I think you start to get that productivity improvement and continuous improvement. I think that's one of the issues. I don't think that the tools are so much the issue. I think creating expectations, Bede was talking about, and we hear this all the time, it's great at the top, but people further down are not following we hear that. That's what we've got to change. I think it has changed already, but you just got to keep at it year in, year out on making sure people understand the expectations.
Can I throw something else in here, Melinda?
Yeah, sure.
So Simon's asking about why we have greater productivity growth, and a lot of the discussion we've had this morning is about productivity in building stuff, right? And that's really important, right? And we're here to get value out of that. But there's a couple other things we're not talking about in terms of productivity. One is selection of projects in the first place, and the other is making sure we get the best value from them throughout their lifetime. And actually, if you read IA's report and you look at some of the context there about outcomes you want to achieve and systems, right? Some of that's not just about building stuff. So it is about making sure we are very carefully assessing what infrastructure do we need, what are all the options before we build stuff. And then when we have built it, how do we maximise its use? And it is about maintenance, and sometimes it's about PPPs and that sort of thing, but it's not always about that. Sometimes it's about other policy levers we can use to manage demand. And so that's the bit about the productivity conversation we're not really having about how do we get productivity out of infrastructure. Selection and the build and the use.
So there's actually a question here around what three specific changes should governments implement to shift productivity? So what I'm hearing is we've got a bit of a culture and expectations piece, thinking more broadly about this. So yes, selection and build is really important, but then and it makes sense because we've talked about them being long-lived assets. So of course the productivity of what you do with them for the next 50 years is critical. So thinking about that more broadly and thinking about what the other policy levers are that sit around that to maximise the productivity and presumably the resilience.
Absolutely.
So that's the three that I've just cobbled together there.
We don't need it. You've done it for us.
No, I'm just, this is my job to try to pull these things together. Okay, two more questions I think I've got here. And now I'm just quickly, everyone's putting questions in, so I have to keep up with them. Let me start with this one, which is from Owen again. You obviously know Owen, Jonathan, so do you all know Owen? Am I the only person who doesn't know Owen?
If you don't, you should.
Okay. Should iBodies make post-implementation project reviews happen? Philip, we haven't heard from you for a second.
Yes, so I think absolutely. I think without learning from, the experiences throughout projects, it's very hard to then inform the early planning. So I think it's absolutely essential that we do. I think that's something, look beyond iBodies. I think it's something that is usually left behind because of the issue around capacity of the market. When you finish a project, you straight on to the next one. So I think those post-completion reviews are absolutely essential to help inform not only the productivity question, but delivery more broadly.
Any disagreements?
No, I agree. Government are shit at doing it, but it's something that we really need to do.
I think the other thing is, at least in the most recent crop of projects, it takes so long to plan them and deliver them. Sometimes you don't get to the benefits realisation work, and for quite a long time, because they just take so long to get delivered. But I do think that people at that point, collapse in a heap and say, we've done it. It's operating, and there's a lot less attention to that. I mean, they're structurally required under our assurance process, and we report them, up to Cabinet. But I think it's not surprising they get less attention than some of the stuff.
It's understanding what's the right time to do it as well, because if it's a benefit realisation piece, you've completed a project, so you can say, yes, it's on time and on budget or otherwise, but have you actually delivered the benefits or not? So there's trying to find the optimum time to do them before people have all moved on.
I guess the thing I'd observe, having worked across a variety of policy areas, is that the land of infrastructure is not the only one in which evaluations are not done all that often or not done that well. And so there's a more fundamental thing going on here about resourcing and incentivisation for there to be assessments both at the completion point of a particular, but over its life too. And there is often very little incentive for government or project teams to actually do a really rigorous assessment when a project's delivered, but over the long run, there absolutely is incentive, because how else are we going to learn?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that, because if you think about everything that we've been talking about, learning from past experience, not making the same mistakes, etc., it just seems like the incentives would really be there to sort of go through the project, not from a perspective of you did this badly, you did this wrong and you're terrible, but what do we learn from this and how do we make sure that we use our resources better? We manage risks differently and more proactively. I mean, what's the shift that's needed there? And I totally accept your point about evaluation more broadly, but in the context of this, it seems like the benefits are so tangible. Why don't we see that as a sort of culture of just continuous improvement?
I think it's a bit of taking a portfolio view versus a project view.
Yeah.
People move on from project to project. It benefits the portfolio, but to Jonathan's point, there's not necessarily the incentives within the project itself to do it. So it's kind of creating those incentives so you get the project people to look at a broader portfolio view.
Or resource the portfolio to do it, rather than relying on a project to do it where it may not happen.
Yeah, I think just I don't know what to do about this, but one thing I'd sort of say is that in our system of governments change regularly. But one thing that I guess I've observed in New South Wales, the government here has been in various forms in government for 11 years now. And so they've got a lot of battle scars in projects. And so when we go to them and say, hey, this is a lesson we should learn, they already know, they've experienced it themselves. I'm not arguing against democracy about changing governments from time to time, but that's one thing we've got to get better at, is making sure that whoever's in power is receptive to learning those lessons from projects that have either gone off the rails during delivery or haven't delivered the benefits that they said they were going to deliver at the beginning.
I'll give you a perspective from having been involved in the resources industry, where you've seen, we've talked about data, we've talked about information sharing, even within organisations, the capability now to be able to go back through data and information to understand where you've made mistakes in the past or could do better, and actually embed that into future projects. It seems like a massive opportunity, particularly if you could connect across jurisdictions so that people can share their learnings and insights from different projects, and that we're now more enabled to do that than ever. Philip, you're nodding.
Sorry, it's Phil here, Melinda. I think that's an extremely good point, because I think our ability to be a lot more dynamic in this space can really change how we look at it. And so it's hard for people to, if you talk about major projects, you're talking about a number of years, and to then think back when you have the lessons learned session and really pick up on everything becomes challenging. And I think if you can do it in real time, and technology provides that avenue for us to identify the issue in real time and to actually capture that and start analysing that and feed that back to the team, I think that's a very good point, and it should be done on the spot rather than waiting for a debrief at the end.
We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, and I don't want to stand between the opportunity for people to stand up and stretch and all the rest of it, but there is one question here, and it's got a few votes. I just want your perspectives on it, quick and dirty perhaps, but the question is around recent iBody recommendations being seen to be heard but not necessarily acted on, and how do you as organisations sort of maintain your relevance, which is kind of interesting given that we talked about how relevant infrastructure is, but I guess it is a challenge about how you make sure you have your influence and impact.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was getting at a moment ago, really, is that all of our advice is only really effective to the extent that elected governments see us as credible, think our advice is important, and that it sort of gels with their sort of understanding the world in some way. That's why I was talking about the experience of governments and then being able to connect our advice to their lived experience, and how we then transcend that and make sure that whoever's in government has access to that and can pick that up. So, yeah, look, I think it's sort of, I always refer to Infrastructure New South Wales, to our team, as an institution in New South Wales now. And I think it's important for us to think about ourselves that way, that we transcend different parliaments and different governments, and that those bodies have that credibility with whoever's in power, and then when we go and tell them there's a risk of doing something, picking the wrong project, delivering the wrong way, that's listened to.
Infrastructure South Australia is similar to New South Wales in the different scopes of work that we have. And so the work that we advise Cabinet on projects, I think, is something that is much more tangible for the politicians. The challenge, I think, for the iBodies is when you start talking about long-term planning, how do you make that relevant and tangible for politicians to act on? I think that's the real challenge for the iBodies. The shorter-term project sort of stuff where we're given advice to Cabinet might be less transparent to the public because, as Simon says, it's part of the whole Westminster system of things. But I think we're having good success there. The challenge is that longer-term strategy piece to make sure that it's tangible for governments and they want to act on it.
Philip, anything from you?
Yeah, look, I can only say I think our board they like to look at it as, even though we're not responsible for implementation of our recommendations, if implementation doesn't occur, then we fail. So I think if we look at it this way, it really brings to home the issue of relevance and making sure that we get traction in terms of implementation. It's early days for us in WA in that we've only recently produced our first strategy with associated recommendations, and that's certainly part of our thinking now, is very much implementation. How are we going to get traction? How are we going to monitor and influence delivery?
Final word for the newest Chief Executive.
Well, yes, but I've been around for a while.
I know.
And the point being that I somewhat disagree with the premise of the question, which is, if I look at the first 30-year strategy that Infrastructure Victoria did in 2016, over 90% of our recommendations have either been delivered or in process. And we've given specific advice to government about a variety of complex matters that they're starting to get on with. And we refreshed our strategy last year, and there's also a very high rate at which government's agreeing to our recommendations and is in the process of considering how to implement them. So I think we are seeing that. But Simon's point about an institution is super important, that thinking about the I bodies as both individual and collectively as institutions that are playing an important long-term role in collaborating not just with each other but with all of you is really important, because it's those collaborative coalitions and changing the nature of what we think of as both the challenges but also how we're going to address them that is going to make change over time. And so I'm feeling pretty confident actually about relevance and influence. It's not something that keeps me awake at night, but it's something we're always focused on. And it is that balance between what does the government need today and the cabinet decisions that they're making versus looking over the horizons, what are governments not incentivised to think about but really need to be? And we need to do both.
Good, all right. Good final word for our session. That's unfortunately all we've got time for. It is time for lunch for those of you who are in the room with us. For the live stream, unfortunately, it is self-catering. We'll see you back a little bit later. We've got breakout sessions after lunch. For those of you here, they'll be upstairs. If you're not sure where you're headed to, please just talk to one of the CEDA staff and enjoy the opportunity to stretch, and we'll see you shortly in the breakout sessions. Thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah, I know you love a photo.
Someone was going to jump in and refute the premise of the question.
Yeah, that's right. It's taken that. Okay. Thanks, Melinda. That was fun.